The founding story of American Universalism reads a little too much like a DC comic book to be newspaper true. But like most great stories, it's probably mostly true. It goes this way. John Murray had decided in 1770 that he was finished with preaching, that he would never preach again. And it's hard to blame him. Murray was a lay preacher in the Methodist Church in England in the mid-1700s. He sat under the preaching of the great evangelist George Whitefield. But somewhere along the way, John Murray became a heretic. He came to believe in Universalism, the faith basically that asserted there was no eternal hell and that all people would eventually be taken into God's great love after death. That God was love and only love. But folks do get addicted to the thought of their enemies burning forever in a lake of fire. And Universalism was not a welcome doctrine in Murray's time. He was excommunicated from the Methodist Church in England. Around the time of his excommunication, he learned of the deaths of all four of his siblings. Soon after, his only son died in infancy. His son's death was followed by his wife's death, and when he couldn't pay their medical bills, Murray was arrested and thrown in debtor's prison. Understandably, he was dejected. Though he was being encouraged to preach Universalism by one of its greatest voices in England, Murray refused. He wrote that he wished, quote, to pass through life unseen, unheard, unknown to all, as though I ne'er had been, end quote. When he got out of prison and set sail for America in 1770, he was determined to make a living doing anything but preaching. Thus begins Unitarian Universalism's only miracle story. The ship Murray was sailing on, called the Hand in Hand, which was bound for New York City, was blown aground by a strong wind, landing on a sandbar at Good Luck Point near New Jersey. Knowing they were stuck for a while, the captain appointed Murray to a foraging party. As he headed inland with the party to find food and spend a few days waiting for the wind to change, Murray met a poor, uneducated farmer, Thomas Potter. Potter was a religious man, and he had built a chapel in one of his fields into which he invited visiting preachers, hoping someone would preach a message that struck a chord with them. Thomas Potter was surrounded by what is sometimes called a five-point Calvinism, a harsh brand of religion that proclaims that God is completely sovereign, that God chooses who will go to heaven and who will go to hell before we're even born. Some say God chooses who will go to heaven but not who will go to hell, but I'm not letting them get away with that. And they say there's nothing we can do to change our fate, but the way we behave in this world, for them, indicates whether we're headed for the pearly gates or the lake of fire. Best to repent and behave just in case, since God is watching you. This was the majority religion in early America. One of the most famous preachers of that brand of Calvinism, at least these days, was Jonathan Edwards. In high school, I read his sermon from 1741 called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Have you read this? Sadly, as I remember, yeah, it's a scar for some of us. Sadly, as I remember it, I think I read this in American literature class. Here's part of that sermon. I'm sure I can't do it like he did it. Consider this, you that are present, that yet remain in an unregenerate state. That God will execute the fierceness of his anger implies that he will inflict wrath without pity on you. When God beholds the ineffable extremity of your case and sees your torment to be so vastly disproportioned to your strength and sees how your poor soul is crushed and sinks down as if it were an infinite gloom, he will have no compassion upon you. He will not forbear the executions of his wrath or in the least lighten his hand. There shall be no moderation or mercy, nor will God then at all stay his rough wind. He will have no regard to your welfare, nor be at all careful lest you should suffer too much, in any other sense than only that you shall suffer beyond what strict justice requires. Nothing shall be withheld, because it's so hard for you to bear. Quoting Ezekiel, therefore I will also deal in fury. Mine eyes will not spare, neither will I have pity, and though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet I will not hear them. End quote. The sermon reportedly fell flat the first time he preached it, a lot like maybe what happened here. But it scared literally the hell out of another audience. One man who was there for that more scary delivery, Stephen Williams, wrote in his journal, before the sermon was done, there was a great moaning and crying went throughout the whole house. What shall I do to be saved? Oh, I'm going to hell. What shall I do for Christ? And so forth, he says. So yet the minister was obliged to desist. The shrieks and cries were piercing and amazing. It had swept early America, this religion, but there were plenty of people who weren't moved by that version of God. And it seems the farmer Thomas Potter, the man who built that little chapel on his property, was one of them. The purpose of that chapel, as I said, was for Potter to invite ministers from various denominations to come preach for him and his neighbors. Potter once wrote, I used to converse with them and was fond of asking the ministers questions. They pronounced me an odd mortal, declaring themselves at a loss of what to make of me. Potter had constructed for himself what was for his time a liberal theology from the many and varied sermons that he had heard. It was a theology centered in a God of love. And so he believed God would eventually send someone to preach that theology, his sort of cobbled together theology. So when Murray's party came across Thomas Potter, Potter asked Murray to preach in his chapel the following Sunday. Murray argued that, first of all, he was never going to preach again. Second, that the wind would change before Sunday and blow them back out to sea, and by all accounts it should have, and he would have to go. But Potter believed that that which brought Murray to him would keep him there until his message had been delivered. Well, the wind did not change. This is the DC comic book part of it. Though by all accounts, again, it should have. And that Sunday, Murray preached the universal grace of God in Potter's chapel. Here's what historian Charles Howe wrote about that sermon. Murray's sermon on universal grace delivered to Potter and his neighbors on September 30th, 1770, was evidently exactly the one Potter had been waiting to hear. And its effect on Murray himself was likewise profound. By the time he had finished, his reservations about preaching were gone forever. I doubt it, but gone for the moment, for a while. Murray went on to become the father of American Universalism. Now, we know that there were other people who were preaching Universalism in America before Murray now. But however it happened, the message truly did gain a following. It spread. And in places that you might not expect. Almost 10 years ago now, I took a motorcycle ride way out in the sticks in Putnam County, Indiana, to find an old brick church building that the editor of the little newspaper in town had told me about. It was converted to apartments some years ago before this, and that's how most people knew it, but it was in an incredible setting. On either side of the building, there were acres and acres of old oaky maple forest. Corn and soybean fields rolled on behind it. It's hard to imagine anyone would ever have wanted to put a church there. But the cornerstone has been preserved to prove the building's original identity. It reads Universalist Church and bears a date somewhere around the 1820s. That little church and so many like it across the Midwest were planted by a traveling Universalist evangelist as part of the wildfire spread of Universalism from Boston, across Pennsylvania and Ohio, into the frontier of Indiana, and further west, Iowa and other places, back in the early 1800s. So many of these Universalist evangelists, circuit riders quite literally, were former Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists who could no longer believe in a God who would punish people for eternity, or at all. They had been converted from that faith to a belief in God as love and only love, and the message caught on. The story of Reverend Jonathan Kidwell follows a familiar pattern for many of these prophets of love. Reverend Kidwell was a Kentuckian Methodist minister in the pulpit at the wise old age of 18 years old, who, to quote historian Reverend Elmo Arnold Robinson, left the Methodists at age 25 to seek greater liberty in another denomination. Quote, in 2 years more he had discarded orthodoxy, and for a time even religion itself, but upon rereading his Bible, he became a Universalist. And from 1815 to 1849, he labored in behalf of Universalism, meeting with lots of opposition and personal violence. He traveled in a circuit in Ohio and Indiana, and get this, when he first moved to Indiana, he estimated the number of Universalists to be about 200. 3 years later, there were about 2,000 Universalists, and in one season, 5 church buildings were being built at the same time. This was a wildfire spread of the message of love over against a more vengeful and hateful God. And God bless the Indiana University History Department, by the way, for preserving this history. The message of love was revolutionary in an age when God was again seen as vengeful and punishing. These days, of course, fewer and fewer of us believe in God. According to some, all we had to do in our culture was become less religious, and we would be more kind to one another, and the angels would sing, and things would get better. I'd like to ask, as Dr. Phil is fond of saying, how's that working for you? Maybe we don't need the notion of God anymore, but it seems God wasn't the only problem. Turns out we still need prophets of love, even in this increasingly secular age. Each of us, I think, is called to embody that gritty, no matter what kind of love that some people call God. I think a deep commitment to love as a core value is just as needed now as it was in the 18th century. Another police officer acquitted this week by another jury for killing another African American man. Friends, these juries are not simply ignoring the law and acquitting police officers. It is becoming very clear that we need to work to change laws, and that will be difficult and sustained work. It will take more than a protest or a snarky Facebook message. It will require conversations, relationships with people who disagree with us, hearing stories that make us uncomfortable, and our commitment to love must sustain us as we go about that work, or we will quickly burn out in anger. We must remember that we're not committed to this work in order to punish police officers. We're committed to this work because Black Lives Matter, and we assert that Black Lives Matter because our core principle is love. Love is more than Hallmark cards, sappy poems. It takes us to places we might not normally go. It requires of us a willingness to be in relationships we might not otherwise be in. This is modern-day universalism, the deep and abiding commitment to follow the path of love into the halls of our legislature, to stand up for the vulnerable, to hold tenaciously to love as the center of our conversations and even our decisions as a congregation. I think progressives forget that. Some of you will disagree with what I'm about to say, and that's okay. It's expected here. It's almost like a sport or something. But I believe there is an odd, counterproductive form of fascism that is developing among liberals that mirrors right-wing fascism. One way it's showing up is the effort on university campuses to shield students from experiencing dissenting opinions. In fact, at Evergreen University in Washington, students took it on themselves to silence a professor who disagreed with them. On June 3rd, journalist Frank Bruni detailed this in a New York Times op-ed. He says, a white biology professor named Brett Weinstein, who identifies himself as a political progressive, infuriated many students for 2 principal reasons. One, he objected openly to a proposal that there be an equity justification or explanation for all new faculty hires. His stated worry was that race would take precedence over all other considerations. 2, the professor challenged an annual event called the Day of Absence. Now, typically, the Day of Absence is when students and faculty of color leave campus for talks elsewhere about diversity, sensitivity, and related issues. But this year, in the wake of Donald Trump's election, organizers suggested that white students and faculty be asked to leave. Weinstein said in an email to an event organizer that he saw, quote, a huge difference between a group or coalition deciding to voluntarily absent themselves from a shared space in order to highlight vital and underappreciated roles, and that same group asking another group to go away. He wrote, this is a forceful call to consciousness. The first, people leaving themselves, is a forceful call to consciousness. The second is a show of force and an act of oppression in and of itself. He added that, quote, on a college campus, one's right to speak or to be must never be based on skin color. Now, look, agree with Weinstein's opinion or don't. Likely this morning there are people on either side of that debate. But the student's reaction to his expression was, as I see it, counter to progressive principles and certainly counter to Unitarian Universalist principles. The journalist writes, dozens of students interrupted one of his classes, screaming at him about racism, white privilege, and white supremacy. The campus police chief advised him for his own safety to steer clear of school grounds until tempers cooled. Students demanded that he and 2 other college employees whom they deemed insensitive to minorities be fired. They chanted, racist teachers have got to go. When the college's president, George Bridges, met with them, several of them pelted him with profanity and ordered him to shut up. End quote. Friends, I will be the first to admit that there are complicated issues at play here. It's not clear to me that Weinstein is right about hiring practices, for example. I haven't seen or read about anything that's worked well for an extended period of time, and even the outcomes, what would define working well, are not agreed on. But I will say without reservation that progress on racism in America will not come by silencing people of good faith whom someone does not think are enlightened enough. We Unitarian Universalists have long had love as our central principle. If that love cannot include people who agree on the goals of greater inclusion but disagree on the methods used to achieve it, then how will we ever truly make progress toward healing our democratic institutions? It is a radical, prophetic act, no matter which side of the political aisle you're on, to proclaim with words and actions that even though you and I may disagree fundamentally, I will behave toward you with respect. And if I cannot personally make it to love, I will not forget that there is a greater love that holds us all in its care. Many years ago, the Universalists preached that message. Still today, we need prophets of a gritty, tenacious love. Let us heed that call. Amen.